Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's really wonderful to be here with you all today. My name is Sandra Safro, and I'm Associate General Counsel for Energy and Technology Regulation at the Edison Electric Institute. For those who are not familiar, EEI is the trade association that represents all U.S. investor-owned electric companies. And I'm going to be your moderator for today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, please note that we've muted the audio for all attendees. We invite you to submit your questions during the town hall using the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen. If you need any technical assistance, please use the chat function to speak to the event host, Elena, which is spelled A-L-E-N-A. We've also designed a short poll, which you'll find on the right-hand side of the screen as well. We invite you to take part in the poll now. It's only going to be open for about 5 minutes, and we really would love to hear your responses. And also, just for your information, this session is going to be recorded. So now, leaving the housekeeping items aside, it is really, truly a pleasure to be back with members of the K&L Gates team who were my colleagues for several years, and in particular, David Wochner, with whom I worked every day of my career before I joined EEI, and with whom I still have the honor of co-hosting our podcast, Hydrogen Rising. I would definitely recommend Hydrogen Rising to folks if you're interested in this area. Our episodes are about 20 minutes long, and we are actually in our second season, which we're quite proud of. Our panelists today are going to be sharing their thoughts and perspectives on the development of hydrogen from around the globe. Their bios are available on the K&L Gates website, so I won't go through them in detail now, but I did want to take a moment to introduce each panelist briefly so that you have a sense of who you're going to be hearing from today and what region of the world they're going to be covering. So we are joined today by James Douglas, who is a partner in K&L Gates' London office. James assists clients with complex, high-value projects in many different market and legal environments, particularly in emerging markets. James has substantial experience advising on project finance and other structured lending, and on project contracts, EPC, M&A, and shareholder joint venture arrangements. We're also joined by David Wochner, who's a partner in K&L Gates' Washington, D.C. office. David works with a wide range of energy industry clients, focusing on natural gas, LNG, and oil-related matters, as well as offshore energy infrastructure development and hydrogen. With nearly 25 years in Washington, D.C., David regularly advises clients on critical federal regulatory and policy issues that impact energy infrastructure and commodities. Kelly Davies is joining us from Perth, where it is currently past 3 o'clock in the morning. So thank you, Kelly, for joining us. Kelly advises clients on energy transactions, both internationally and domestically across the energy sector. Outside of conventional development, acquisition, and financing experience, Kelly's practice also focuses on new technologies and innovative project and transaction implementation in the energy space. Next, we're joined by Melanie Bruneau, who is a partner in K&L Gates' Brussels office. Melanie advises clients on a broad range of areas in European law, with a particular emphasis on regulatory compliance, EU competition law, and antitrust. And finally, last but certainly not least, we are joined by Annette Mutschler-Siebert, who is a partner in K&L Gates' Berlin office, where she assists clients with issues related to public procurement law, as well as European competition and commercial law. And one of Annette's areas of focus is the structuring and support of complex award procedures, privatization projects, and public-private partnership projects, both on the client and on the bidder side. Personally, I am very much looking forward to the conversation today. This is a very timely topic. Hydrogen has been gaining momentum in countries around the world for several years now, and a large component of that interest in hydrogen is its versatility, which itself is actually multifaceted. One component of that versatility is the ability to produce hydrogen from a variety of energy resources that are already part of our energy economy. For example, current production pathways are through coal gasification and steam methane reformation without carbon capture and sequestration. Looking towards a clean energy economy, there's significant interest in continuing to use steam methane reformation, but with the addition of carbon capture and sequestration technology to lower the carbon intensity of hydrogen, as well as interest in using electricity to power electrolysis, which is a process that splits water into hydrogen and oxygen, and a growing interest in other production pathways, including methane pyrolysis, which produces a hydrogen gas and a carbon solid. When it comes to electrolysis, countries and companies are exploring taking power from the grid, using renewables like wind and solar, and using existing power generation like nuclear. I thought it would be interesting to mention that I also read an article yesterday about a finding from the University of Sydney that we can apparently generate hydrogen from coffee. As a coffee drinker, I was very happy to read the further findings in that article that we can also produce hydrogen apparently from rubber and plastic, so our coffee is safe for now. But the variety of resources that can be deployed is an advantage for hydrogen. However, it also means that the way hydrogen markets and economies develop will very likely vary by country and by region, depending on resources that are locally available, which we'll hear more about today. A second component of hydrogen's versatility is the number of potential uses. We currently consume approximately 70 to 80 million metric tons of hydrogen per year, and the main uses are in petroleum refining, agricultural fertilizer, and industrial applications. Estimates project that the global hydrogen market could increase exponentially, perhaps to reach 530 million metric tons by 2050. The potential for that market is driven really by the ability to use hydrogen to decarbonize a range of hard-to-abate sectors where electrification options are either not available or are not cost-effective. Such a market could support hydrogen use to help decarbonize multiple sectors of the transportation market, including maritime, aviation, over-the-road vehicles, and rail. And it could also support hydrogen use in electric generation as a feedstock and fuel in the industrial sector, in home heating, as a method for long-duration energy storage for renewables, and in a variety of other applications. Supply chains for hydrogen already are emerging and appear likely to continue to emerge in ways that are similar to other energy commodities that are currently part of our energy economies. For example, as we'll hear more about today, several countries are looking at importing hydrogen, potentially by vessel or by rail, in a manner similar to what we've seen for liquefied natural gas or LNG. There's also significant work being done to examine whether and to what extent existing pipeline infrastructure can be used to transport hydrogen from production to end use. Hydrogen also has a number of properties that need to be taken into consideration from a safety, policy, and commercial perspective as countries consider how to use this energy source in their clean energy economies. These properties include hydrogen's small size. It is the smallest molecule. It's lightweight. Its low boiling point, which is the point at which it moves from being a gas to a liquid. And hydrogen, like natural gas, realizes a tremendous economy of scale when it is liquefied. Its colorless and odorlessness, its fungibility once produced, and its potential to cause steel embrittlement. These considerations are informing the development of national hydrogen strategies and plans in various ways across a number of countries around the world. In our conversation today, we'll talk about a variety of issues, opportunities, and challenges surrounding the development of hydrogen markets and economies around the world, as well as the role that hydrogen can play in energy diversification and security. We'll start off the conversation today with opening remarks from each of our panelists and then move into a moderated Q&A session and discussion. As a reminder, please put your questions into the chat. Feel free to ask your questions as they come to mind, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. So to start us off, James, I'm going to turn to you in London to give us a perspective from the UK.
Thanks, Sandy. Ironically, starting in London, the UK was one of the last of the G20 members to put in place a hydrogen policy, certainly well behind the EU. My colleagues will cover the EU policy, but the UK published it. When I say hydrogen policy, I mean, of course, low carbon hydrogen, as Sandy, which is saying we've been producing hydrogen for a long time, and it has a long history of use in industrial processes. The UK published its low-carbon hydrogen policy in August last year. This is complementary to other initiatives of the government including the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, energy white paper, etc. So it all has to be understood as part of an overall package. But the highlights of the UK policy for all of you to keep in mind is, as is very common with other national policies, the UK has imposed a number of targets on itself in terms of low carbon hydrogen production. So the most immediate one is a target of 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production by 2030, a soft target of 1 gigawatt by 2025. Based on announced projects, the 2030 goal may be realized, but certainly the 2025 one is in some doubt. A controversial element of the UK policy when it was announced was the dual emphasis on green and blue hydrogen. So Sandy just mentioned production of hydrogen from gas. When it's coupled with carbon sequestration, that's called blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen is production of by electrolysis of water and oxygen. So there's a dual emphasis on that, which was seen by many people as controversial. The government recognizes the UK as a major gas producer, has a large gas infrastructure, and has given emphasis to blue hydrogen as well as green hydrogen. Perhaps recognizing that the government's philosophical approach, the government did not announce very large public expenditures towards hydrogen in its policy, but its intention to create a framework to support private investment in hydrogen through mechanisms such as contracts for differences, which I'll touch on in a second. So the highlight of the government support is the contract for differences I mentioned, which is a mechanism in which the government will give some revenue support to hydrogen producers, giving them enough confidence to invest in projects without the government having to put the kind of capital sums forward that other jurisdictions have put in. As Sandy was mentioning, the government is also looking at the use of infrastructure. The existing gas infrastructure can be used if a certain amount of hydrogen is blended in. So there's a lot of studies around that. But I think the main point is the government has announced its policy, but there is a consultation process on some of the key mechanisms, such as the contracts for differences, which is still ongoing.
Thank you so much, James. We will take a hop across the pond now over to Washington, D.C., and I will turn it over to David Wochner to give us a perspective from the U.S.
Thanks, Sandy, and good to be with everyone today. Nice to see my colleagues all around the world. And Kelly, thank you for being up at 3 a.m. in Sydney. So we're grateful to have you participating with us today. There's obviously been a substantial amount of activity in the United States with regard to the development and deployment of hydrogen at scale. I think, one of the starting points, and I think there's a tendency to think that hydrogen is new. What is interesting is that the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office at the U.S. Department of Energy has been in existence for quite some time. There was a real push in the George W. Bush administration to advance hydrogen that really fell out of favor when the Obama administration came in and started moving toward kind of this notion of electrification of everything. That Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office has done phenomenal work over the years, led by Dr. Sunita Satyapal. And Sandy, you and I have joked that they have kind of rapidly become the belle of the ball here as hydrogen has really taken off as a focus of our energy strategy. So Maybe a few kind of just quick things to highlight on introduction, and then I expect in Q&A, Sandy, we can get into some of these in more detail. Of course, as most people I expect are familiar, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed last year, had substantial provisions for the development of hydrogen, including roughly $8 billion appropriated for the development of a number of hydrogen hubs across the United States, particularly focused in encouraging the diversity of production pathways, encouraging the use of the domestic resources that the United States has. To James's point, including the development of both blue hydrogen, hydrogen produced from traditional fossil fuels with carbon capture, and also renewable hydrogen. And then as well, grant money appropriated to the Department of Energy for the deployment of manufacturing and recycling of clean hydrogen technologies. The Department of Energy is moving forward on those. They recently issued RFIs to solicit input on how those grant programs should be solicited and ultimately executed. We are expecting for the hydrogen hub that the funding opportunity announcement will come out in May for that $8 billion program. Happy to talk a bit more detail during the Q&A on that part, Sandy. Of course, we also have what was known for a time as the Build Back Better Act, which would include a hydrogen production tax credit, which, certainly our sense in the marketplace with our clients is that while the hub, $8 billion appropriated through the hub is fantastic and is really going to help develop a network, that production tax credit is really, really a critical component in order to advance upstream hydrogen production. So, and bring that cost of particularly green hydrogen down. Of course, the ever powerful, perhaps all powerful Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia has signaled on numerous occasions his displeasure with the very large and broad Build Back Better Act, which appears now to be dead. And we have now renamed it not the BBBA, but just the BBA, which is Building a Better America Act. And there is a lot of indication that the clean energy tax credits that were part of the Build Back Better Act will remain and actually be something that perhaps there is bipartisan compromise on. So we are still cautiously optimistic on that. And then lastly, I would say, Sandy, I think there remains some uncertainty surrounding kind of the permitting and the siting and how we're actually going to get this done. How are we going to build the infrastructure to facilitate the deployment of hydrogen? And so there's some jurisdictional issues, I think, that we're looking at and really need to be conquered, quite honestly, before we can achieve scale. And I think all of that is hopefully going to be a focus of this administration, ensuring that we're able to move forward. So maybe I'll stop there and turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, David. Certainly a lot to circle back on. We will now go down under and visit with Kelly to hear a little bit about what's going on in the Asia Pacific region.
Welcome, everybody. For anyone who is mad enough to be joining over my side of the world at this time zone, really, I'm probably going to largely focus on Australia, but there are clearly some key allegiances starting to emerge from the Australian part of the world, particularly with Korea and Japan. So one of the real focus areas for Australian government, both at a federal and a state level, is focusing on those export opportunities, which will essentially drive scale and scale up in the Australian market. I'll take the opportunity, particularly for those who aren't familiar with the status of play over here, just to jump in briefly on where things are at across the different states and across federal level. Fortunately, we're not America, so it won't take me forever, but we do have both states and then federal level related policy. So bear with me. Starting off at the state level and in no particular order, in New South Wales, which is where I currently am, late last year, September, New South Wales government released a report, the development of a hydrogen industry in New South Wales. The purpose of the report was to address the current state and opportunity for development of hydrogen-related projects in New South Wales as a state. That particular program aims to commit 70 million Australian dollars of approximately a 750 million net industry and innovation program budget. One of the primary focuses at this stage is around hubs in particular areas where there is both the geographical requirements to meet project development over here, but also tends to focus on areas that have been traditionally focused on old energy sources such as coal, with a view to repurposing those regions, facilitating and fostering jobs, technology and knowledge. A little later, October, one of the New South Wales government departments, Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, also released its hydrogen strategy. The intent around that was a real focus on green hydrogen, which we heard from James earlier is principally focused on electrolysis of water using clean energy sources. And in that strategy, the aim will be to provide $3 billion in support of the hydrogen industry in New South Wales across a myriad of options throughout the supply chain. Moving north to the Northern Territory, much smaller, we don't call them a state, they're a territory, but similarly smaller and certainly on their journey in terms of energy innovation. They have their hydrogen master plan, which again came out last year. The focus really is to try and develop a very evolving economy in hydrogen and clean energy more broadly. The Northern Territory certainly is geographically well located for potential export opportunities to broader APAC. Queensland, again, similarly well situated for those export opportunities. Their government approach to date has really been focused on jobs, jobs, jobs. Queensland government is typically always very focused on the jobs capability and an entrenched skill set within their state. So to date, they have the Queensland Renewable Energy Jobs Fund, which is really designed to provide value and initiatives that bring investment into the state and have a jobs component. Separately, the Queensland government themselves are directly supporting innovation in the hydrogen space. Most recently, they've announced that they will be both themselves and separately supporting private sector participants to move into the transport sector in terms of purchasing zero-emission vehicles. That includes hydrogen vehicles. South Australia, probably one of the most active states in terms of its commentary around its clean energy program more broadly, but specifically hydrogen. Touching on some of the high notes, probably one of the states that have committed the most funding in reality, as opposed to necessarily in terms of numbers that have been spoken about in the media. They are actively promoting a number of projects that are underway in terms of hydrogen production. They also very recently, just Tuesday of this week, have announced that they will support and develop a $593 million hub in Whyalla, which is one of our sort of principally industrial areas, and focus on the clean energy movement, looking at integrated clean energy solutions, which will now include hydrogen. Victoria, which is a little sad, and apology for any Victorians on the line or that hear the recording, are a little lacking and a little behind the curve, I guess, in terms of the other states. Their focus to date has really been on business readiness. So they're looking at the downstream part of the supply chain, I guess, and their current focus is how they support some of the industries that Sandy spoke about earlier in using hydrogen. Whilst they might not necessarily be putting the same level of funding into hydrogen initiatives I think we can all agree that focusing on the demand side in our domestic economies is equally, if not more important to some extent, to get some of these hydrogen developments moving. Western Australia is one of our resource-intensive states, and so they're very focused on the hydrogen aspects of their economy. Again, healthy levels of funding going into various project development and hydrogen generation projects. At a federal level, it's to be confirmed what we will be doing at a federal level. The federal level has really been focused on legislative harmonization with the state-based laws and certificate of origin schemes. And I think we'll probably touch on that later. So with that in mind, I will stop there and we can touch on more of the detail as we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. Really appreciate it. Okay, so I will now turn it over to Melanie to give us a perspective from France and the EU.
Thank you, Sandy, and welcome everyone. Yes, indeed, on my side, I will review the developments at French and EU levels. And to set the scene, let me start with highlighting some recent EU and French developments showing a commitment to hydrogen at EU and national level. Within the French national hydrogen strategy for the development of decarbonized hydrogen, and within the France 2030 investment plan, the French state is planning to devote 9 billion euros to implement its hydrogen strategy. So with this, France is willing to be one of the hydrogen leaders and to support structuring industrial projects in this area, which is mainly to meet three objectives. The first one being the production of electrolyzers, the second one being the development of key equipment for hydrogen mobility, and the third one, the production of hydrogen for the decarbonization of industrial sites. And very recently, 2 weeks ago on 8 March, the French Ministry of the Economy visited Port-Jérôme-sur-Seine site, which will actually host a 1,000 megawatt-hour hydrogen production unit by electrolysis. And by reducing the site's CO2 emissions by 220,000 tons, the project will contribute to the long-term competitiveness of industrial activity in France. And by this project is expected to reduce France's needs for fossil fuel and contribute to its energy autonomy. And at EU level, we've also seen a number of milestones contributing to sustainability and to the development of hydrogen. As you may recall, this started with the European Green Deal. It was presented by the Commission on 11 December 2019, and it has set the goal of making Europe the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. It was followed by the European Climate Law on 30 June 2021, which has inserted in binding legislation the EU's commitment to climate neutrality and the intermediate targets of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. More recently, last year, on 14 July 2021, the European Commission adopted the Fit for 55 package, which is a package of proposals to make the EU's climate, energy, land use, transport, taxation policies fit for reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by the target of at least 55% by 2030. So overall, the objectives for the Commission is to achieve the targets agreed in the European Climate Law. Now, with Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is a further EU objective to make Europe independent from Russian fossil fuels, and notably gas, well before 2030. And the Commission has proposed a plan on 8 March 2022. It's entitled Repower EU. And this plan outlines a series of measures to respond to rising energy prices in the EU and to replenish gas stocks for next winter by diversifying gas supplies via higher LNG and pipeline imports from non-Russian suppliers, as well as larger volumes of biomethane and renewable hydrogen production and import. And this is for this reason that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said at the time that the quicker EU switches to renewable and hydrogen, combined with more energy efficiency, the quicker we will be truly independent in our energy systems. So I'll stop there and we'll continue during the presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melanie. And I appreciate you hitting on the energy diversification and security topic. Okay, and to finish us off, we'll turn it over to Annette, who will share some thoughts from the Germany and also the EU perspective.
Thanks a lot, Sandy, and welcome everyone. Yes, I can directly follow up on what Melanie has been saying. Never has energy transition and the movement to renewables been more important than now. And that's general feeling in the EU and in Germany as well, of course. The commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050 has been even stricter in Germany. We want to be carbon neutral by 2045. So we have to get there soon, and the decisions have been made to move away from nuclear power this year already, and then from coal in the near future. So renewables really are the building stone, the most important building stone of our energy transition. It's a necessity, even more so now looking at the dependence of Russian oil and gas deliveries. So Germany has traditionally been very active in the hydrogen space, and not only since it has published its hydrogen strategy in 2020, but already long before that. That was the second stage, basically, of the German strategy. The first phase already started in 2006, and over 1.2 billion euros have flown into ground research development projects, basically getting technology readiness in place. And now the second phase that's been kickstarted with that announcement in June 2020, is meant to kickstart the market, to really bring support, operative projects, to build electrolyzers. 3 to 4 big electrolyzer projects are going to be operative this year, to have pilot projects for hydrogen use in different industries, and create incentives for trading hydrogen, because we'll need trade. And that's the most important point, perhaps, about the German strategy. It's all about green hydrogen. So it really focuses on green, renewable hydrogen, and we won't be able to produce all of that in Germany. So the funds dedicated to that strategy, 9 billion here as well, have been distinguished into 7 million for projects within Germany and 2 billion for international collaboration projects. And one of those is with Australia, as Kelly well knows. That's just been concluded and intensified last week. So the sectors that are basically targeted, well, there is a lot in the transportation space. We already have public procurements of hydrogen buses and trains in Germany. But we're moving more into the decarbonization of industries like steel and chemical industries, and trying to create incentives for that. James has talked about the carbon contracts for difference. That's something that's being developed right now in Germany as well. And just to give you a quick flavor of what's happening with these budgets, there's 3 pilot projects going on at the moment that overall have 740 million euros of funding, and are being dealt with by international consortia of research institutes, industry, academia. One of them is H2 Mare, or C, It's got the goal of producing hydrogen on sea with offshore wind turbines and then transforming it into easily transportable forms, so ammonia and other things. That's one of those. The next one is TransHyd. It develops, evaluates, and proves technologies for transporting hydrogen. Transport is a big subject. We need infrastructure, or we need to be able to transport it in different forms. And the third one is H2Giga, furthering the production of electrolyzers at scale. I already mentioned some projects are already underway, but we'll need more of those, because the overall goal is to produce 10 gigawatt of green hydrogen in Germany by 2030. I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll discuss further.
Great. Thank you, Annette, and thank you to each of you for your opening comments. Thank you to all of the participants who participated in the poll. We appreciate the feedback, and it does appear that there is an interest in a bit of discussion around the different production pathways. So we'll focus a little bit on that in the beginning of the moderated Q&A. And again, encourage folks, if you have questions, please drop them into either the Q&A or the chat. Preferably the Q&A just makes it a little bit easier for us to sort through and answer, but if the chat is more easily available to you, that works for us as well. So to start off with a question on the production pathways, James, I'm going to start with you. I'd be curious if you predict that blue hydrogen development in the UK is going to be as significant as the UK government had indicated in their strategy paper, or if you think that green hydrogen will begin to come to the forefront as it appears to be doing in most of Western Europe.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. I think the events that have been just mentioned in Ukraine, and the issue with the gas price, which actually had manifested itself before then, as well as actually the parallel increases in electricity prices, have all got a heavy impact here, and quite a lot of those post-dated the introduction of the UK policy. The blue hydrogen decision, I guess, to emphasize that in the UK, I think is partly relates to the fact that the UK is a significant gas producer and has a large amount of gas infrastructure already. There are also quite a lot of announced projects. BP have announced a very, very major blue hydrogen project in Teesside, 1 gigawatt, with 500 megawatts expected to come online by 2027. There's an ENI project, HyNet, Equinor, Saltend, and Humberside. So I think that the numbers are there for blue hydrogen. I would expect the green hydrogen, as in most other jurisdictions, as the price differential between blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, and then between hydrogen and higher carbon forms of energy will decrease over time. But the way the UK is incentivizing these projects, and I was glad that Annette mentioned contract for differences in Germany as well. It's the kind of tried and tested approach in Europe for government support, and certainly has been in the UK with offshore wind and our new build nuclear program. The contract for difference model won't distinguish between green and blue hydrogen, at least in terms of philosophical approach, but we'll have to deal with the different pricing of the two options. But I expect over time, I guess the effect of the gas price movements are still kind of unknown. But that's the differential between blue and green hydrogen is largely down to the gas price. But I expect over time, as in most other jurisdictions, green hydrogen will be the major type of hydrogen.
That's great. Thanks, James. Kelly and David, I'd be curious from where you each sit in countries that have significant fossil fuel production capabilities and are very big players in global liquefied natural gas markets. How are you seeing hydrogen development proceeding in each of your countries in terms of production pathways and the underlying energy sources that are being used. And Kelly, maybe we'll start with you.
Sandy, yeah, very, very topical at the moment, particularly in Australia. I mentioned earlier that one of the main areas of focus for federal government is a federal level certificate of origin scheme. So there has been consultation last year with all of the industries, all of the market participants. That is currently being reviewed, but it's probably fair to say that at this stage, Australia is remaining reasonably agnostic in respect of the production pathways, provided that there is the ability to account in real terms for carbon emission reductions. I guess what I mean by that is a lot of the debate is around subjects such as additionality, vintage of any carbon credit related schemes and such like, and whether there would be the capability to grandfather any historic or currently underway type projects. One of the things Annette obviously spoke to was the initiative very recently announced between Australia and Germany, affectionately called Highgate, which is designed to fund German and Australian collaboration for hydrogen-related projects. I think at the moment for Australia, one of the key challenges is, Sandy, the abundance of our older energy resource and capability, but the understanding that the key markets that we are likely to participate in from an export perspective are largely going to be focused on green hydrogen. Now, that's a bit of a political balancing act for Australia at the federal level, and I think in some respects that may delay our progress, if you like, in coming out one side or the other. I think ultimately Australia's fate will be dictated by those foreign jurisdictions with whom we want to trade, as opposed to the domestic industries who still have quite a lot of political clout. If we are truly going to succeed in terms of being a global hydrogen player, but it's probably fair to say at the moment there's definitely looking at both blue and green and focused on carbon capture storage as an avenue for the carbon component of those projects, but we'll have to watch and see.
So Sandy, I'll jump in there. I think it's fascinating because I think the U.S. is going to be the reverse of that, right? When we are developing the hub concepts not with an eye toward export, right, but with an eye toward the creation of a national network, and some of that is, I think, our geography and our density of population, right? I mean, you look at the population of Australia, the landmass is roughly the same size as the United States, but the population of the entire country is the population of our 4 biggest cities in America. So full stop, right? So it's a very different calculus for us. I don't think it's an export-minded market that's driving it. Not to say those projects couldn't come to fruition. Of course they could. But I think there's much more focus on the creation of a domestic network. And to the point of renewable hydrogen versus, steam methane reformed hydrogen and the development of carbon capture, I look at even just this morning, everything in the news now, breaking news that Biden administration and the EU are going to be announcing, something that accelerates the exports of American gas to Europe. I've seen a couple headlines that have included the export of hydrogen into that discussion between the U.S. and the EU. But at the end of the day, there's very little that can be done because the infrastructure doesn't exist yet, at least with regard to hydrogen. So understand that there's an opportunity there. So to that point of green and blue, and I know you and I have talked a lot about the color nomenclature, and we both don't like to use it because this really should be a discussion about carbon intensity of the feedstock or of the energy source or the carrier. If we don't find a way to, and people have touched on this a little bit, if we don't find a way to standardize the commodity, or at least to provide certificates of origin, something that indicates what the carbon intensity is, it becomes almost impossible to develop a global trade in the commodity, right? I mean, you don't know what the result is going to be if you're shipping a cargo into Europe and we don't have some sort of framework that exists. The last point on the green versus blue, there's no question in the US there is substantial focus on the development of renewable hydrogen. But I think that given our domestic industrial sector that exists in the United States, and the opportunity, the pressure on the industrial sector to decarbonize, and the need to find as many tools as possible to decarbonize when you know you're an energy intensive heavy industry, I think that there's going to be significant opportunities for traditional sourced hydrogen with potentially either whether it's carbon capture, whether it's pyrolysis. I think we had a question in the Q&A related to that, and the use of solid carbon perhaps as an end use. I think there's going to be significant opportunity for that still. And we've even seen some utilities that are looking at and working with some utilities that are looking at developing an electrolyzer. And I think there's a tendency to say, oh, electrolyzer, it's renewable hydrogen. No, I mean, they're content pulling power right off the grid. And they don't know what that power is. It could be gas-fired generation. It could be renewable. But the idea is to produce the hydrogen and to get that hydrogen, blended into a gas distribution line or, local use somehow. So I see very much an opportunity for both.
Great. Thanks, David. There are really, truly a number of different threads that I am excited to start pulling on. But I do, before I do that, do want to turn it to Annette. Annette, you mentioned that the German focus is on green hydrogen or renewable hydrogen. And with that in mind, I'd be interested in your perspective on whether the German hydrogen projects are likely to be homegrown or through trade collaborations, and really what the hurdles are that you foresee with each of those.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sandy. And I personally think that the color nomenclature is really a fascinating subject because it starts with the different bases of calculation, right? Everybody understands something different under green and blue and pink and whatever there is. If we're talking about collaborations and hurdles for collaborations, I'm totally with David. The main hurdle in my view is we don't have a uniform standardized certificate of origin scheme worldwide. And unless we develop that and have a common denominator and understanding, we won't be able to trade, and we won't be able to really make sure that the lowest carbon emissions product is the one that gets the most funding or is paid the most. You have to incentivize trade. So if it's collaboration and it's not homegrown projects, we need to have some way of subsidizing that in a way. And what we do in Germany is called H2 Global. It's a kind of double auction process. So there's an auction for the purchasing of the green hydrogen from Australia or the Mediterranean or Africa. And then there's sales auction as well. And the delta between the two prices is going to be paid by the state. So that's one way of making sure that trade can happen. That project has just been granted another 900 million euros by Minister Robert Habeck a couple of weeks ago. So that's something to deal with, one of these hurdles. But I do truly believe that we need a standardized certificates of origin scheme to further trade. Then another one for collaboration cross borders definitely is transportation. We'll have to figure out, and that's why I'm so excited about that pilot project. We have to figure out how to transport hydrogen in a way that's efficient and commercially viable. So those probably are the main hurdles for international collaboration. And for our homegrown projects, well, I mentioned it before, we're not a huge country. We don't have that much sun, so it won't be possible to produce all the renewable energy we need in Germany, even though there is a sufficient, or there's a significant scaling up of solar and wind energy at the moment, and that's been boosted by the recent events. So we're going to scale that up. There'll be an obligation to have photovoltaic on each office building that's going to be built in the future. We'll have larger tender procedures. So there's a lot going on there, but I think, yeah, the availability of renewable energy is definitely going to be a difficult one. And then funding always is difficult, but in Germany, probably it's less about having the funds, but finding the right funds. So it's a myriad of different things. It's different layers, state level, federal level, and then there's the EU level as well. And the government has thought about that and has prepared a new website that is supposed to help in getting through that jungle, but it's still one of the most often asked questions by clients. So which one is the right one for my project? I'm a company that wants to reduce my carbon footprint, as David said. That's the one side, right? I'm an off-taker in some way, or I'm someone who wants to move into Germany with an idea for a hydrogen project. I want to develop something. I want to build something. And for both sides, there's loads of different funds, but it's very difficult to find your way through the jungle. But once you've done that, there are significant opportunities, I think, in Germany. And so we will be able to build out the homegrown ones, but in the end, it'll be a mix. I'm convinced it will continue to be a mix, and that's a good thing.
That's great. Thank you, Annette. I want to continue with this topic, but pivot slightly to a subtopic that you've each hit on a bit, which is the certificates of origin. And Melanie, I'd like to turn it to you to talk a little bit about the French approach to certificates of origin and traceability, and maybe use that as a way to open up a broader conversation among our panelists about what they're each seeing in their respective regions of the world and with their respective clients on this issue. So Melanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. Well, indeed. I mean, we've seen a number of important legislative developments in France, and I think some of them are really worth mentioning because of what they are trying to achieve notably in the hydrogen space to implement the hydrogen strategy. The hydrogen deployment in France is mainly governed by the Climate and Energy Law of 8 November 2018, and it mainly provides that 20 to 40% of French consumption of hydrogen will have to come from a renewable source or low carbon by 2030. And under this new legislation, it guarantees the right of access to natural gas facilities to low-carbon hydrogen producers. So this has been one of the important milestones a couple of years ago. And after a long journey disrupted by the COVID-19 health crisis on 22 August 2021, the climate law entitled Climate and Resilience was finally enacted. And what's interesting about this legislation is indeed that it clarifies the mechanism of guarantees of origin, where now the Energy Code defines a guarantee of origin as an electronic document used solely to prove to an end consumer connected to a natural gas network that a given share or quantity of energy was produced from renewable sources. So the government has drawn a first legal framework for guarantees of origin for renewable hydrogen with the ordinance of 17 February 2021 on hydrogen. So this has also been an important step in France because it provides the extension of the free transfer of guarantees of origin to the production of renewable or low carbon hydrogen produced by water electrolysis. And in that context, it's also worth mentioning that the Code of Energy was also updated to now define 3 categories of hydrogen production. And we are, with this development, moving away from colors. I could hear from my colleagues around the world a number of, colorish issues with hydrogen. So with this change, France has defined renewable hydrogen as being produced from electricity produced by renewable sources. So this is what we called used to call green. It has also defined low carbon hydrogen. So this was previously what we would call blue or yellow. Yellow being produced from nuclear energy, and what we called carbonized hydrogen, which is the gray one produced from fossil in the industry. So with that, actually, the willingness of the French legislator is to accelerate the development of renewable hydrogen or low carbon by giving legislative value to the development of objectives of the hydrogen in the space.
That's great. Thank you, Melanie. Any other thoughts from our other panelists on how you are seeing certificates of origin or related issues develop in your regions? And then I have a question for James on contracts of differences, which is what I started to say in my head, but just to stick with certificates of origin for the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Sandy, I'll just jump in real quick here. I mean, certainly at the governmental level, federally, there's nothing moving in the United States on adopting some kind of standard certificates of origin. What I think is interesting is in the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed in November of last year, 2021, and which is now in the process of being implemented, there's a mandate in there that the Secretary of the Energy, working with the Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA, will develop an initial standard for carbon intensity of clean hydrogen production. So that's very, they specifically identify that as, of course, produced from renewable energy, from fossil energy with carbon capture, utilization and storage, nuclear, I think there was a kind of a catch-all, like any other source that has applicable production technology that allows for clean production or something. I mean, it was a little bit of a generic statement. But that definition of clean hydrogen that was in the law, and which DOE and EPA are now going to work to kind of create and I assume publish what that standard will be, defines clean hydrogen as hydrogen produced with a carbon intensity equal to or less than 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent at the site of production, right? So it's not kind of broader scope 2, scope 3 emissions, but it's at the site of production of per kilogram of hydrogen produced. So that's the benchmark. The statute, the law gives the Secretary of Energy and EPA the ability to in fact, maybe let me rephrase that. It's not the ability. I believe it's mandatory that within 5 years, they have to reassess whether 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent is still the right level, or whether that should be ratcheted down and, really forced, which at the end of the day, that is probably the right direction, right? To move the industry over time to essentially zero carbon hydrogen. But that's where we are. It is not taking the form at this point of certificates of origin. I think individual counterparties, and maybe a good transition to James, individual counterparties are trying to account for that in their agreements. If they're producing renewable hydrogen or they're producing grid power hydrogen through electrolysis in that supply contract.
That's great. Thanks, David. And that probably is a very good lead in to my question for James on contracts for differences. But you mentioned earlier, James, and I think Annette had also mentioned, I think if you can just share for folks' edification what the contract for differences is, and then it'd be interesting to hear what your expectations are for the terms of the contracts for differences for low carbon hydrogen production, and more specifically, low carbon hydrogen production mentioned in the consultation document on the low carbon hydrogen production business model.
Well, thank you, Sandy. As Annette mentioned, the UK and other European jurisdictions are looking at contract for differences. The UK is still hasn't released the final details, but as to your question, expectations, I think history can kind of point us in the right direction. A contract for difference, as it applies to this sector, will be effectively the government. If the counterparty is to be a government entity, which it has been in the offshore wind industry and the new nuclear build, and the market expects will be the case with hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen. The government effectively takes the price risk between an agreed or fixed, what they call strike price, which is kind of the agreed price that the producer needs to recover their costs and make a return, etc., and a floating, what's called a reference price, which is intended to represent a market value of hydrogen. And there are, for those people who operate in the electricity markets, I mean, VPPAs and contract differences models are very, very common in the electricity industry, and were certainly a vital component to offshore wind getting off the ground in the UK. The reference price is the difficult thing to come up with, though, because I think we've been talking about green and blue hydrogen. Different jurisdictions will have different approaches for their reference price. So, I mean, the UK is, as I mentioned at the beginning in my kind of introduction about the approach, Annette and Melanie both talked about 9 billion euros being put in by the respective governments. The UK government, I think the kind of biggest headline commitment was £240 million. I didn't even bother mentioning it in my introduction for this low carbon hydrogen fund. But the big support will be through this contract for differences, and it's meant to address the fact that the market has not developed a mechanism to bridge the gap between the cost of hydrogen produced from higher carbon sources to lower carbon sources, because we don't have a perfect market for carrying through the kind of social cost of carbon emissions. So the task for the government is to come up with a reference price which reflects that, and the government's consultation document in the UK had 7 possible approaches to this, with all sorts of things like, do you refer it to a carbon price? Do you refer it to a gas price? Do you refer it to the actual price received for hydrogen? But whatever you agree, and what the government is leaning to here is an interim step where there's an actual, the reference price, which is floating, is the actual price achieved for the sale of green hydrogen. And the concept is, if the reference price is higher is lower than the strike price, so the agreed price at the beginning, the government will make a payment, or the counterparties of the contract, which is likely to be a government entity, will make a payment to the producer of the green hydrogen, or the hydrogen doesn't have to be green hydrogen. If the reference price is higher than the strike price, then the payment goes the other way. So in that way, there's a floor. The producer will always receive at least the strike price. So that's the model. Now, if you look at, and the philosophy behind the UK government's approach is that they intend this government support to be a relatively short term. Now, nobody kind of knows how short is in this context, but the government's expectation is the market will find a way to price this hydrogen properly. And we already mentioned earlier that there's all these factors coming in, like the gas price is high, energy security is important. All of these things are changing constantly. So the government is going to try to provide some certainty for producers of hydrogen. The things that haven't been, there's quite a lot, which is, as I said, it was a consultation on this business model. The consultation period ran through most of last year. Heads of terms of this contract for difference were due by the end of the first quarter of this year. I certainly haven't seen this. I don't know if they're public. They're probably running behind. But I think, given that the UK had success in developing offshore wind, which I think nobody can really deny it was a successful program, and we used for new build nuclear, I think a lot of the characteristics of those programs will find their way into this. So one of the key issues will be the duration. So the nuclear new build contract's 35 years, but that reflects the fact that the generator has to reserve a lot of money for decommissioning. So it shouldn't be that long. The offshore model was 15 years. So it's probably going to be closer to that. And then there's the issue about how is the reference price, how's the strike price set? Is that through private agreement or through an auction system? So that has to be worked out. So there's quite a lot of issues to be worked out. And the reason I made the point about different geographical approaches, I understand that the Portuguese approach, for example, is all around the gas price. And that kind of reflects the issues that the Spanish electricity markets had with power prices recently, and the laws that were introduced in Spain to claw back profits due to high gas prices. Perhaps we won't have the same emphasis in the UK. But in a nutshell, the CFD is critical because that's how we're going to get bankable projects. The UK government is not going to throw in £9 billion, as a kind of a block of money into the sector, but it will stand behind these contracts and allow private sector to provide the funding.
That's great. Thanks, James. I do want to pivot a little bit to a question on investments and subsidies, but before I do that, I did want to throw it open to the other panelists if anyone had comments that they wanted to make on contract for differences. And there was also a question in the Q&A about how the color scheme would apply to derivative fuels like ammonia and methanol. So if anyone would like to answer that, I wanted to open up an opportunity for that as well before we pivot. Okay, we will go ahead and pivot. And I suspect that the answer to the question on the color scheme pulling through to ammonia and methanol is that it very much probably still remains to be determined how that's going to play out in individual markets. Just pivoting a bit and I guess pulling the thread somewhat on James's last point about government investment. And there's a question in the chat about state subsidies. Kelly, I'd like to turn it to you first with a question on investment. You described really a number of different policies and approaches across the various states in Australia. And I'd be curious if you can talk about some of the immediate political and policy-driven initiatives that may either make or break investment in the Australian hydrogen market, and whether those might be state-driven or federally driven within the Australian government.
Sandy, and it's a great question and incredibly topical. I talk to a number of investors globally looking to enter or already in the Australian energy market more broadly, but principally those focused on the clean energy market. And the overriding commentary is that despite Australia's developed status as a country, despite it having a strong economy, from an energy investment perspective, it is still considered a medium risk country. And the reason is that there is not consistency of political commentary in support of foreign investment into energy. And I guess just diving into that a bit deeper, what does that mean? You touched on it a little bit, Sandy, in terms of my introductory comments. In the absence of federal leadership with respect to a federal level energy policy, the states go it alone. And what that drives is less harmonization across the country and more competition between states. So every state has its own initiative. Every state is looking to leverage its capability to bring investment into their own state. And I think what that indirectly does to a large extent is it puts the focus on the domestic investment rather than the end goal. And Australia's end goal is to be an export superpower for hydrogen. And if that's what we really truly want to be, my personal views are that needs to be led at a federal level. And then the states, to a large extent, the states and territories need to have complementary regimes that enable jobs, investment within each state, as is the best for their geography. I mean, for example, South Australia is probably one of the leading states in terms of its hydrogen strategy, hydrogen investment, and real implementation, but geographically is not necessarily the best suited to export. Ultimately, things have got to go further. And so I think one of the things and one of the discussions I've been having with a number of state-based representatives is that we need to, and to coin a phrase, put our money where our mouth is and start to show investors that both state and federal government are genuinely going to support the growth of the hydrogen economy. Certain states are definitely moving in the right direction. I spoke to South Australia, I think New South Wales and Queensland and WA. They're all doing the right thing and making the right steps. I think the challenge for investors is longevity. Australia has a pretty checkered past in terms of both change of the political view of the day within both state and federal government. We've seen that recently, bit of a change with the South Australian elections. And even they, despite the progress they've made, there's some uncertainty in investors as to whether projects like the multi-million-dollar Whyalla project are still going to be championed, because there is some commentary to the contrary coming out of the most recent government. So I think Australia's biggest challenge is what it has always been in the energy sector, which is consistency of government support in the same direction, rather than going in multiple directions, because otherwise I think investors are still quite nervous about putting substantial amounts of capex, which is what the hydrogen industry is going to need, into the Australian market.
And Sandy, if I can just kind of pick up on that for 1 second, I could not agree more in terms of that consistency. And I think, and in the US, that we're starting to see that, right? The messaging that is coming out from the Department of Energy, that is coming out from the White House, the Biden administration, is a consistent message of support and a recognition that the U.S. development of hydrogen resources and capabilities is not just good for America, but it is good for the world, whether or not we become an export, superpower, as Kelly talked about for Australia. And I guess one other point, which if anyone's noticed me kind of looking to the side, it's because while we've been on, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the U.S. had their monthly meeting, and in a complete reversal from their decision 1 month ago, has said that their new policy on analyzing greenhouse gas emissions and requiring mitigation for gas infrastructure is not going to apply to pending projects at the Commission. 1 month ago, they said it would. So every single project that had an application pending now is going to have to redo their application, figure out what was required. And there has been so much pressure, and it has been pressure from Capitol Hill. It has been pressure, I think, even from the White House to say, look, we have Europe in crisis. Energy prices are through the roof. The market appears to be, kind of out of sync, out of whack. Like, we should not be doing something that is harming the development of U.S. natural gas resources right now. So I think that consistency of message that Kelly talked about is also critical. And I think, fingers crossed, I think we're starting to see a real straight line on that point in the U.S.
That's great. Thanks, David. And actually, I'm going to pull the thread a little bit on a topic you mentioned, infrastructure, because the idea of developing hydrogen is one thing, but the practicality of actually putting these supply chains and markets together is another thing. And I know that at least Annette has a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle in her driveway, which is amazing, but of course is something that's possible because there is a hydrogen fueling station. There's the infrastructure within a close enough distance to her home for her to be able to have a vehicle like that. So David, I'd actually like to turn it to you to start us off maybe with our last question, because I think we've got about 10 minutes left on infrastructure. And if you can share some thoughts on what infrastructure do you think might be needed in the United States to enable a hydrogen economy? Are there changes in policy or regulation that we need to start to see? How does this sort of fit in with the bipartisan infrastructure law? So leave you that kind of complex, very open question on infrastructure.
I promise I will not take the entire 10 minutes. Okay. I think it's an important question. The kind of premise of the bipartisan infrastructure law provision on hydrogen was the creation of a national network for hydrogen. In a country of our size, with 320 million people, the only way to create a national network of hydrogen, which is a molecule, is by pipeline. There is no way we're going to have enough trucks, driving all across our highways from Maine to Florida with hydrogen. And so we have, I think, critical work to do to both from a regulatory perspective and I think engineering and safety and understanding how we can facilitate the incredible pipeline infrastructure that we already have in this country, whether it's crude oil products, natural gas liquids. I mean, they crisscross tens of thousands of miles crisscrossing the United States of pipelines. And those are existing assets. We have to find a way to deploy those assets for the transition. And I think hydrogen has to be part of that. You asked kind of about, does policy have to change or regulation? There is a real gap. And I think this is at the heart of it. If we're going to move hydrogen molecules, by interstate pipeline, there is a real gap in understanding on who has jurisdiction. There's at this point, it is pretty clear there is no federal jurisdiction in one body, one agency over the siting of a pipeline. If you wanted to put in a pipeline that runs across 2 states that is hydrogen only, it appears that you would just go to each state individually, get your permits and build. There's some argument that an agency called the Surface Transportation Board, which I expect literally no one of our 58 plus participants has ever heard of. There's a good reason for that. There is an argument that under the law that empowers that agency, they would have jurisdiction over the rates that a interstate hydrogen pipeline would charge. I mean, that is not a recipe for success. An agency that has no experience in this, that is not well known and doesn't have the robust regime in place to deal with it. What we need is an agency like FERC that is a single, point of contact, a single source that has been citing interstate pipelines for decades, and has a regime in place, has staff, has very bright, science advisors, engineers, air emissions consultants, all on board. That's what we need, I think, in order to create this national network. Now, the kind of counterpoint to that is, to the extent hydrogen can be done on a very local basis, right? You don't need to have massive export in the United States, at least, in order to make it successful. So there could be situations where you're able quite locally to develop infrastructure in an easier way, right? And, maybe it's local permits, maybe it's something like that. The last point I would say on that is education. And I expect this applies whether it's the United States or Australia or France or Germany or England, like education and engagement with communities so that they understand what hydrogen is, what we're talking about, why it is advantageous. It is a zero combustion, fuel source and feedstock. That is a huge part of this in order to build and deploy the infrastructure, in my opinion.
Great. Thank you, David. I guess we've got a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to check with each of our panelists to see, of the questions that we've asked so far, were there any topics that you wanted to make some further comments on? And Melanie, maybe we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you, Sandy. Perhaps following up on the question regarding the fact that we are in the early life of the industrial use of hydrogen. It's exciting, but there are many obstacles. And I tend to agree with that, not only at French, but also at EU level. France is one of France's main objectives is to build a competitive French electrolysis sector by installing 6.5 gigawatt of electrolyzers by 2030 to produce 600,000 tons of carbon-free hydrogen, and also to generate more jobs. But indeed, it takes time to build this new sector, and it will also require a lot of funding. I think same for one of the other main objectives of France, which is to develop hydrogen mobility. Like you said, before converting land passenger and freight transport to hydrogen trucks, buses, or trains, you need to develop a number of key technologies, and this will continue to develop with what's expected. We see with future hydrogen-powered ships, but also hydrogen-powered aircraft by 2030s. So we see this, and I think this the construction of the hydrogen ecosystem will be developed gradually. That's also understood at EU level. The EU has thought of the deployment of this hydrogen ecosystem in different phases. The first phase being 2020 to 2024. But then the next phase, indeed, 2025 to 2030, will likely show that hydrogen use will be expanded to new industrial applications, steel making, trucks, rail, maritime transport. It will also require the construction of electrolyzers as well. And then it's only in the third phase from 2030 to 2050 that the Commission envisages a more mature and cost-competitive hydrogen ecosystem. And it's only at this stage that it foresees that green hydrogen technologies will be deployed at a larger scale. So indeed, it takes time.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. We have just a couple of minutes left. Kelly, any final thoughts? I know it's almost 4 o'clock in the morning or probably after where you are.
I guess probably just one final comment from me, and it touches on one of the questions in the Q&A around the effectiveness of subsidies and how quickly governments could step away from them. I suppose a bit of a cautionary tale from Australia is the solar industry in particular. I suppose one thing I think certainly over here we're very cognizant of is that those types of arrangements really do drive a very competitive attitude, and sometimes that competitive attitude drives down bid prices to a level that aren't necessarily sustainable. We certainly had those issues in the Australian renewables market, which have caused certain investors to struggle and ultimately to pull out of the market in more conventional renewables. So I think that probably gives some context as to why Australia is a little more reserved on following actively a CFD type arrangement that we're seeing coming in sort of out of the UK and other EU jurisdictions at this time. That said, I think they do have a role to play, but slowly and steadily. The other thing I suppose I just wanted to add, and I think a lot of us on the call are hearing about it already, are some of the developments in electrolyzer technologies in particular that are, we had one recently in Australia, homegrown technology that is suggesting that they can really slash the efficiency of the hydrogen production that will drive down cost quite rapidly. So I'm very excited about that. And I think that's where, to my mind, subsidies can really support, is still not losing focus on the R&D in favor of commercial support, I guess. So keeping that support and subsidies more broadly and not focusing too quickly on commercial support for project development.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to let David wrap us up, but before we do that, Annette and James, any final thoughts?
I just wanted to end with a positive view of what everybody's been discussing. I do think it's completely correct that it will take time. And in the interim phase, we will need state funding. We'll need a proactive policy framework. But now's the time, and there's never been a better time to make that switch. There is a real need, and there's a real political will. At least I can say that for the EU, and it sounds as if that's the same in different regions as well. And so if we heed the comments and the caveats that Kelly has just made, yeah, we should still continue developing and researching. Technology is there, but it can become more efficient. Transportation can become more efficient and more cost effective. But if the money is used for that, I think we're on a good path to be successful.
Just a very quick comment from me. I mean, I think we've all heard how different nations have different approaches on the regulatory side, which is absolutely correct. But I think international cooperation on certificates of origin traceability for gas would be very, very important for development of this market. We're seeing in some of our transactions there's an appetite to pay green premiums for gas in the same way that you see in the power sector. So I think international actions on that would be very useful.
Yeah.
Sandy, great. Let me just, on behalf of the global K&L Gates hydrogen family, thank you for moderating us today. Appreciate all of your support. For all of our clients and friends on the phone and those who will listen to the recording, grateful for your participation and engagement. And if you have any questions or require any assistance, As you can see, we are all deeply in the weeds on these issues around the globe, and happy to help and work with you. Sandy, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to do this. And I think that brings us to our conclusion. So thank you everybody for joining, and please feel free to reach out to the K&L Gates team if you have questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes, and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.